To make a resin inlay pin, transfer your black and white image onto a piece of 18 gauge or thicker metal. I like to use rubber cement to glue my paper down, and I'd like to coat the back of the paper really well with the rubber cement and then press that onto the metal and let it dry really thoroughly before continuing to work. The next step is to drill holes in all of the negative spaces. So I'm going to drill a hole in all of the white areas of my design. Now I'm going to use my jeweler saw to pierce away all of the white areas out of my design. Once you're done piercing the inside and outside border of your design, go ahead and peel off the paper that you glued down. Once the paper is removed, you'll be able to see your design in a little bit more detail, and you want to go in and clean up any areas that need a little bit of refinement. You can use a needle file for areas that are large, like this one. You can also use your jeweler saw blade as a tiny file and go in and really clean up in the tight areas that are too small to access with a needle file. Once you're happy with your pierced design, go ahead and flip it over and use relatively coarse sandpaper to sand the back, and this is to clean it in preparation for soldering. Your piece should be flat and completely clean before soldering. You'll need to prep a piece of metal for the back plate. This can be thinner, like 20 gauge or so, and it should be similar in size and shape to the top piece, but it shouldn't be exactly the same size. Give yourself a little bit of extra room in case things move around while you're soldering. And then go ahead and sand that piece of metal so that it gets really clean for soldering. We're going to flow solder on the back of the pierced piece first before we put them together. And so whenever we flow solder on one piece of metal first and then join it to another one, it's called sweat soldering. I'm putting flux on the back of this piece, just trying to coat the entire back with flux. I'm trying to remove some of that excess if I can. And then I'm just going to set it down on my soldering pad. While my flux is still wet, I want to put little pieces of solder on every detail of my piercing. I'm using medium solder for this step, and you'll see that I'm trying to just place a small piece of solder on every little detail of the piercing. It's really helpful if your flux is wet for this step. It's going to help your solder stay where you want it. So if you have to, you could dip your solder into your flux to keep it wet. I usually use wire solder, which is what we have at my university, but you could also use sheet solder, which looks like this. And if you have sheet solder, basically you cut a strip of fringe and then you cut across the fringe to create lots of small pieces all at the same time. This is what your solder should look like before we heat it up, so you can see how many little pieces there are all around the surface. Now we're going to flow the solder. The first step is to get the flux to dry, so I want to use a bushy flame and not get too close to my piece while I gently warm it up as the flux dries. If your solder does start to move around, you can use a solder pick or tweezers to push it back in place and try to make sure it stays on all the little details of your design. Once the flux is white, you know it's dry and you don't have as much risk of your solder moving around. So it's time to turn the flame up a little and get in closer with your heat. I want to heat the piece really deliberately at this stage. I don't want my torch to stay in one place on that delicate piercing because I could melt some of those really fine lines. So I want to keep my flame moving, but I want to point the blue cone of the torch really deliberately at the areas that I want to get hot. When the flux turns clear, it's a good indicator that the solder is getting close to the flow temperature. So I want to keep heating really deliberately, and you'll start to see the solder flow onto the metal. I want to keep my torch moving and work my way across the piece, getting each piece of solder to flow. Now I'm going to prep the metal that is going to be the back of the pen. So I'm going to take that piece that I sanded earlier and flux the whole surface. And I'm going to put that piece on this steel tripod. I want to take the first piece that I flowed solder on and flip it over so that the solder side is facing the base piece. Notice how it's right on the edge of this tripod. The tripod is steel and it acts as a heat sink, so I need to use a lot more heat now in order to get my piece hot enough for the solder to flow. I'm going to take a really hot flame and heat only from underneath, and I like to even use tweezers to prop my piece up off of the steel tripod so that I can get it hotter faster. If you heat your piece up too slow at this stage, it's just going to oxidize and get dirty and your solder's never going to flow. When I'm heating from underneath, I'm careful to point my blue cone directly at my metal but not get too close. And I'm watching for that top layer of metal for that solder to flow. It usually will sort of sink down and you can see it kind of flowing around the edges here, and it all is flowing together. After you've soldered your piece together, you're going to pickle it to get all the flux and oxidation off, and then you're going to saw off that excess metal from the bottom. After you saw that metal off, you're going to need to file the edge. So hold your piece on the bench pen and use your file to just clean up and refine that edge. After filing, you're going to want to use a sanding stick to further refine the edge and sand out your file marks. Now I'm going to flip the piece over and sand the back, and this is in preparation for soldering on my tie-tack pin back. So I want to get the back really evenly sanded so that it's really clean for soldering, but also that it looks nice and neat because this is going to be the final finish on the back. So I'm going to place my piece on a honeycomb pad and flux my little tie-tack pin back, and then place flux in the area that I want to solder the tie-tack pin back. I'm going to use easy solder for this since it's the last thing I have to solder on this piece. I'm going to use a relatively small flame to pick up this little piece of easy solder with my solder pick and put it right on the end of my little tie-tack pin back. and I just need to gently heat that pen back and the solder's going to flow on there. I'm going to pick up that tie tack with a pair of tweezers, and then I'm going to turn up my torch flame and I'm going to point that blue cone directly at the large piece of metal that I'm trying to heat up. So from here on, I'm not really going to let the blue cone point at the little pen stem again. It is small enough, it's going to get enough reflected heat that the solder is going to flow from the pen to the larger piece of metal. So notice how my blue cone is pointing directly at my large piece of metal. I'm kind of keeping that flame moving. My flux is clear, so it's about ready to flow. And as soon as I see the solder flow, I move the torch away and keep the pen in place until it solidifies. Here's a little up-close view of what that flowed solder is going to look like on that pen stem. This is a really nice and neat way to get your pen soldered on. Go ahead and pickle your piece, and then it's time for some final cleanup. I'm going to sand the front of the piece. Sometimes you get a little bit of solder spill that happens on the front, and so you want to make sure you sand all that off. It's still not quite good enough yet in this image, so we're going to sand it some more and get every bit of the solder off, just like that. So it should be really clean on the entire surface. Once your piece is clean, you can go ahead and patina it. So I'm going to use liver of sulfur to turn my copper black. You could leave your piece copper colored if that was the color of line that you want, or if you're using brass, you could leave it brassy, or nickel, you could leave it silvery colored. That kind of depends on what metal you've chosen to use, but with the copper pen, I like to go ahead and give it a liver of sulfur patina. I usually dip my pieces in the patina at least 3 times, and then I want to make sure that I use a brass brush at the end and really burnish that patina into the surface so that I'm not left with any powdery residue. Now we're done with all the metalsmithing components and it's time for the resin inlay. I'm going to use a 2-part epoxy resin that I ordered online. You can also order these from jeweler supply companies. And you can use a variety of things to add color. I like dry pigment, so a lot of times I will just shave off chalk pastels to create a dry pigment, but you could use other things too. You could use things like makeup and nail polish. You could use different types of paint. You know, you could get creative with what you put in your resin for color. Probably the most important part about using resin is that you use equal parts of each. So I like to use wax paper to work on as a nice surface, and then I'll pour out an equal amount of part A and part B, and these often have sort of a different consistency, so this can be a little bit tricky. So not only is it important that you get an equal amount of each part, but it's also very important that you stir the 2 parts really thoroughly. So I like to use a little piece of wire with a bent end to do this, and I just try to stir the 2 puddles of liquid together as thoroughly as I can. There's a really long work time with these 2-part resins. It's not like the 5-minute resin that you get at the hardware store. You have a couple of hours really that it stays pretty liquid, so you don't really have to rush here. You can take your time and really stir it together really thoroughly. Once you feel like you've stirred it together enough, you can start to add your pigment. And you kind of want to add enough pigment that your pigment's going to be opaque, especially if you've patinaed your piece like I did, because otherwise that black background is going to show through. So I want to add quite a bit of pigment to this. And again, I'm going to stir that pretty thoroughly. When you inlay resin into your piece, it's really important that your piece is laying flat. If it's sitting up at an angle, the resin is very liquid and it's going to want to leak out. So if you're making a pen like this, you might want to poke it through a piece of cardboard like I have, so that you can help it to sit flat, and then you can either set it on a piece of wood with a hole drilled in it, or I'm going to set it here on my bench pen to keep it flat while I work. Now it's time to inlay resin into the piece. So if you have a fairly large area that you're trying to fill, you can scoop directly with the wire that you've used to stir and scoop up a little resin and then let it drip into the area that you're trying to fill. Once you start to lay your resin into the piece, you are going to have to try to spread it out a little bit. It's going to want to sort of ball up, and so you want to spread it out so that it reaches every nook and cranny of your design. And it's especially doesn't want to go into really tight corners, so you're going to have to kind of use your tool to push it into the corners so that you don't have air bubbles. It's really important that you take your time when you do this and you don't get color in areas that it doesn't belong, and that you don't overfill areas. You just really want to take your time and be careful. It's not difficult, but it is easy to get too much resin or to drip it in an area that you don't want. So really just take your time as you do your inlay. Depending on how detailed your design is, you can have some areas that are really tricky to get a tool into to spread your resin. So one of my favorite things to use for this is actually just a broken saw blade. You've used your saw to saw those lines, and so you know that the saw is the right size to fit into even the tiniest little area. If your piece is really detailed, you may even want to inlay color one day and then let that dry and then do another color the next day, just so that you don't risk dripping one color into another. This resin takes 24 hours to cure, so you really have to plan ahead in order to finish your piece in a reasonable amount of time. It's a really nice resin because it has a really long working time, and it also debubbles really well, so it's not going to be bubbly in the end, but the 24-hour cure time really does, it takes a long time, and so you have to plan ahead to make sure that you give yourself enough time to finish. You're just going to continue this process with each color or mixed media that you add into your resin, and just take your time and kind of do paint by number, adding your resin to one little area at a time. I think it looks best if you try to fill each color to the same level, so whether that means slightly underfilled or slightly overfilled in every cell, just a little consistency can make it look a little better. When you've filled every cell that you want to fill, you want to let your piece cure about 24 hours, and then I recommend saving your wax paper so you can touch that stuff that you've mixed instead of the piece to see if it's cured, and if that has cured, then your piece has, and it's all finished.